Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kirsten Wiley and I manage the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Today we welcome Scott Berkun here to discuss with us the true origin of inventions, discoveries, and breakthroughs found in his book, The Myths of Innovation. Through exploring the history of innovators, Berkun demystifies the concept of epiphany to reveal the truth about how breakthrough ideas are generated and evolve, giving us the confidence to seek true innovation and to solve problems. Scott Berkun is the best-selling author of the books Making Things Happen and The Myths of Innovation. His work as a writer and public speaker have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, NPR, MSNBC, CNBC, Wired Magazine, and other media. He worked at Microsoft from 1994 to 2003, taught creative thinking at the University of Washington, and is a regular contributor to Harvard Business. And he runs a popular blog at scottberkun.com. So please join me in welcoming Scott Berkun to Microsoft Research. Thank you.
Good afternoon. How are you doing?
Good.
Good, okay. That's my robotic introduction. So now I'm going to have the fun, friendly introduction. So hi, I'm Scott. I'm a former Microsoftie, so this feels sort of like coming home. So if I'm sarcastic and I act like I know you all and I've been where you are, that's because, at least in my memory, that's what actually happened. So I'm going to talk to you about innovation for about 45 minutes. And the stuff I'm going to talk about, the stories I'm going to tell you, they're actually mostly not stories that show up in the book. Has anyone actually read this book? Or a couple of you, some of you? Okay. And the reason why I don't actually talk about that much stuff in the book is I've had the experience of going to see a lecture or talk. I'm like, wow, that's really cool. And you go and buy the book, and it's exactly the same. And I feel really disappointed by that. And it's not their fault because it's hard enough to write a book. And it's not their fault because it's hard enough to give a good presentation. So when you're asked to do both, you kind of overlap and try to reuse and recycle and be efficient. These are the backdoor people. Boom. See, they snuck in. Okay. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about a bunch of stories and stuff that don't actually show up in the book for the most part, but they're very much like the ones that do. So if I say stuff that interests you, or you like the way I think about things, the way I frame the whole idea of innovation and creative thinking, I recommend you check out the book. There's some for sale in the back. There's sample chapters that are available you can look at for free up on the website, so I recommend that you go and do that. But before I actually talk about the book, she introduced me, that's pretty good. The only thing you should know for reference later when it comes up in Q&A is I'm actually really looking forward to Q&A with you guys. Because I'm a former Microsoftie who's been out in the world for about 5 years. And I make a living as an author and a public speaker and a consultant. And a lot of what I public speak, that's an effective use of English, public speak, a lot of what I public speak and write about and consult about is project management, creative thinking, innovation, how you manage innovation. And I spend a lot of time in places that are not here. But I used to work here. So we can have a really interesting conversation, if you guys want to, about what I've learned since I've left and how that compares to what's going on now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one example, I would love to talk to you guys about Chrome. I used to work on Internet Explorer. I don't really work on web browsers anymore, but Chrome and IE and the whole great conversation we can have, that's up to you. You guys are going to be up to whatever you want to talk about in Q&A. We will get to that. So I used to work in Internet Explorer. That's the most important thing you need to know about my history that has not been mentioned so far. Now, before we start talking about innovation, I want to get us on the same page a little bit about our points of reference in history. So I'm going to show you pictures from the history of innovation, and I want you to call out the names, if you can guess them, of who is being pictured. You guys are good. Van Gogh. Excellent. Ear is a giveaway. Here's a giveaway. This guy, a little bit harder. Anybody know? Not an artist. You can tell by the shirt and tie. Not an artist. Doug Engelbart, very good. The mouse is a giveaway. There's a giveaway in most of these photos. Doug Engelbart is the inventor of the mouse, should be a household name, but for reasons that we may talk about later, he is not. Tesla, who said that? How did you know that? Are you like in the Tesla family or something? It's like in your family album? Yeah, Tesla, inventor of basically wireless communication. So every time you connect to a wireless network, you have this gentleman to thank for that, Tesla. Mary, you guys are good. You guys are scoring way above. This is Mary Curie, the only person ever in history to win a Nobel Prize in 2 different sciences. Mary Curie. And you don't know this one. Unbelievable. Anybody? If you work at night, you owe it to him. Edison. This is Edison. Young Edison. Young Edison. Yeah, there's no giveaway in this one because that would have been too much of a giveaway. Anyone standing next to a light bulb kind of gives that away. How about this guy? Bob Dylan. This guy, Einstein. Okay, so we had 6 or 7 pictures of these people famous for being innovators in their fields. And I'd like to ask you this question. What similarity do they share? I'm sorry? Smart, yes. Looking for less obvious ones. Someone could say they all appear in your presentation. Yeah, that would not be that interesting.
They totally upset the environment when they broke away from tradition.
Upset their environment. They created they were disturbers. Eccentric. Outsiders. Bad hair. Not smiling. Kind of depressive looking people, don't you think? Except for Einstein, of course. But that's a very unusual picture for him. He doesn't look that way in most of his pictures. The thing I'm looking for, which is the key theme in all the stuff I'm going to talk about, is that these guys were not A students in their fields. They were not the people who followed all the rules and did all the things they were told to do. They largely violated principles, did the opposite of what their teachers or instructors told them to do, and they paved their own way. And more specific to modern age thinking about creative thinking and innovation, none of them took a course in creative thinking. None of them went to an innovation seminar. None of them got an MBA with a concentration on entrepreneurial venture capitalist funding projects. They just decided on their own that they cared about an idea and pursued it to the detriment of their finances, to the detriment of their family relationships, to the detriment of, in some cases, their psychological well-being. So there's traits here that can be pulled from any innovator you pull from any field that largely hold together pretty well. They don't follow the rules. And the idea of having a structured system of being an innovator, a structured plan you can follow, a playbook, the 7 steps to being the next Da Vinci, is absurd and ridiculous. So a lot of what comes up when you dig into innovation history in any field, technology field, which we'll talk about a lot, in software and hardware and engineering, but also in the arts, in sciences, they all follow similar patterns of following their own way. So the idea that you can find some structured system for doing these things is contradictory. It's oxymoronic. It's a fundamental thing that you should understand from the beginning. If you pick any famous innovator, no matter how well you think you know what they're famous for, and dig into what they were doing at the time before they became famous, you will find these patterns. And those are the patterns that are most useful to you if you want to be an innovator yourself, is to go and look at what are those patterns, what kind of habits did they have, what kind of challenges did they put themselves into. Most of these people were not asked to do the things they became famous for later. But the stories that we know, most of the stories that we're told, the things that we're told as kids, the things that show up in media reports and on the cover of Wired magazine, focus on epiphany, magical moments. The first day that something happened, the first moment when something was invented, the first day when the code ran. We focus on the story when basically the thing is already done. We love these stories. We're fascinated by them. But they don't really help very much in trying to become someone who has a famous epiphany story told about you. There's a bunch of reasons for that. Before I talk about those reasons, I want to talk about this story. So who can tell me what's going on in this picture? Famous, historical, scientific. Newton and gravity. So who can give me the 10-second, 15-second TV commercial version of the story?
Apple falls from tree, discovers gravity.
Apple falls from tree, discovers gravity. What's the moment that discovers gravity? Hits him on the head. Who here has heard that story? Everybody. Just about everybody. Where'd you hear that story? Pretty much everywhere. Where's the first place you heard the story? School. Yeah, you went to public school, didn't you? Yeah. Okay. So Schoolhouse Rock, actually, I went to public school too, so we're on the same page. But Schoolhouse Rock is the place I first heard the story. Schoolhouse Rock being the cartoon that shows up between other cartoons that injects a little bit of bogus history, so you pretend like you're getting an education while watching ABC cartoons and watching ads for, Transformers and Apple Jacks and all those other things. So as you may guess, given the context of my talk, this story is not true. It's very far from the truth. It's also a ridiculous story. It's a ridiculous story because Newton was alive in the late 17th century. And we know that for hundreds and thousands of years, we had a pretty good understanding of gravity. We built lots of things. We engineered towers and weapons and castles that all required the understanding of gravity in principle. So the idea that someone discovered that in a moment in 1680 is completely ridiculous. But why is it a story that we like so much? There's a couple of reasons. There's a pattern of story that I call the Epiphany mythology, where there's a magic moment that is driven by forces that are out of our control. In this case being the forces of nature. Newton's sitting under a tree. Who knows what he's thinking about? We don't know. He's sitting there. He's basically slacking off, right? Sitting there under a tree. Something hits him. Some act of God, some thing from beyond him, strikes him, and now we have gravity. How much responsibility does Newton get in this story? Almost none. Who's really the motivating force in the story? It's the apple, right? The apple's really driving this. Come on. Figure out gravity now. It's hitting him on the head. A violent act. It's beyond his control. It's also, these stories also make it easier for us to feel okay about not being innovators or creators ourselves, because there's no outside force. Now, the Greeks would call this the muse, that there's these forces that we do not control, that exist outside of us. They're spirits that we pray to and beg to help us out, to grant us the equivalent of being hit by an apple. But the fallacy of the story is, the popular, the placating fact in here that we like so much is if it doesn't happen to us, it's okay. I've sat under trees. I didn't discover anything. I did the same thing Newton did. Not my fault. Not my fault. I didn't get the muse. Not my fault. It's a very passive idea of what creative thinking and innovation is. Now, the true story, the short version of the true story, is that even if this moment did happen, which it probably did not, what Newton actually discovered and became famous for was the discovery and the proving mathematically of the theory of gravity. He proved it mathematically, how the system of the solar system works, through a mathematical set of functions and formulas to prove that gravity worked, why the Earth actually moved the way it did in elliptical orbits around the sun, or whatever shape the orbits were. And it was this huge book, a 500-page book that took him 15 or 20 years to write. That's what he became famous for. And this was meant to be a symbol of that discovery. But over time, we tend to winnow down these stories, which are much more boring. 15, 20 years of work? I don't want to do that. I'd rather try to get hit by an apple, right? I want to try to have lightning strike me. I want to try to win the lottery. Much more interesting, compelling, and relieving story that we can all connect with. This story makes Newton seem like an ordinary guy. 15 or 20 years of work is not ordinary. That seems like, wow, that's like a lot of effort. It's a lot of time not spent under trees. So here's another one, the last epiphany myth. We can talk a lot more about epiphany myths because they're all over the place, but this is another one I want to talk about. This is a telephone. Anyone know a story about the invention of the telephone?
Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see
Mr.
you.
Watson, come here. I want to hear you. So do you know just give me like the 10-second larger version.
Alexander Bell spills an acid, it makes the connection. He yells out to Watson in the next room, and Watson actually hears him through the wires.
Great. Watson, come here, I need you. Who here has heard that story? So many of you have heard this story. So you know a story about the invention of the telephone. Does anyone know any other stories about the invention of the telephone? No. So it's too late, sorry. Too late. If you want to get that in there, you got to get in early. I had the whole effect. There's an empty room. I'm not going to let you ruin that for me. Okay, so what does that story tell us about how to invent whatever's going to replace the telephone? Accident. Have a buddy named Watson that you yell at sometimes. Be clumsy, right? Apple falling on tree, spilling ink. These stories are often ordinary stories that the only value they have are anecdotal, over drinks. Hey, do you know how the telephone was invented? Do you know the first thing that was said over a telephone? You don't? It was Watson, come here. You drink, you act like you know something, and you seem smart. But you don't actually know anything in that. There's nothing in there that gives you a pattern to replicate, a habit to copy, or a path to place your ambition. So any time that you hear a story about innovation or about creative thinking, it almost always focuses on a particular moment in time. The first day, the first time, the first time this was used, the first time it was seen in public. And those stories are useless. And in doing work on this book, I taught a course at the University of Washington, Creative Thinking. I have an interest in creative thinking. I always have. I've taught at creative thinking and working on the book. I wanted to make sure I had a complete understanding of the latest research in psychology about what creative thinking is. How does it work? What's going on in their minds when someone's creative? So I asked these questions, and the mistake most people make are focusing on these moments. when all the data and the research that we have, the best practical research about the difference between a creative person and a not-creative person, has a lot more to do with patterns, habits. What do they do every day? What things do they go through every day? What are their patterns? What goes on 5 minutes before, 10 minutes before they get an idea? Those are interesting questions to ask. So the first pragmatic thing I can give you is any time in the course of your daily work or at cocktail parties where you're listening to a blowhard tell you about the beginnings of something, what you want to do is say, okay, well, what was that guy doing 10 minutes before, an hour before, a week before? What was he doing every day? What habits did he have or she had that led to that moment being possible? So in the case of Newton, if you had said, okay, maybe he did get hit by an apple, but what was he doing the day before, the week before, month before? In Newton's case, he was asking questions. He was a scientist. He spent his whole life developing the skills for observing the world and saying, why does that work that way? Why doesn't the apple fall sideways? Or why does it fall at that velocity and not? He was a question asker every day, all the time. So maybe he was sitting under an apple tree. I bet it was not the first time. I bet while he was under the apple tree, he wasn't, smoking pot and reading Harry Potter. He was like, I'm looking around at the world. Like, why does this work the way that it does? That's something you can copy. Why does my code work the way that it does? What are some other ways this could work? I see this cool discovery that someone else has invented. Well, what are the parts of that? What's the smallest component I can understand? Okay, once I get this component, what's the next component work? So you want to ask yourself what happened before, a week before, a month before. Where are the patterns? So anytime we talk generally in popular literature, this is true for magazine articles, it's largely true on the web, the short attention span of blogging about creative thinking and invention and entrepreneurship in the world today focuses on these moments to a ridiculously overdeveloped degree. What you want to do if you want to become a creator, an innovator, a progressive person yourself, say, wait, there's got to be a pile of work that's not as sexy, it's not as exciting, that made that moment possible. And I want to become a student of this work. I want to see the patterns that I can copy and emulate. And maybe I'll never be a Newton, but I'll be a little bit closer to being creative and finding things that other people are less likely to find. So the second, by the way, you guys are free. If you want to interrupt me for a question at any point, just raise your hand, interrupt me, as long as you can keep it kind of short. If you have a longer, more complicated question, save it for the end. Okay? Fair? Good? Yeah, if you guys like, too much information. Okay. The second pragmatic thing I'm going to tell you is this. The word innovation is a buzzword. We use it all the time. We throw it around. We'll be more innovative, do more innovation, 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 innovation. It really doesn't mean that much anymore. It doesn't. It's a very easy word to say. It's got 10 letters in it. Letters are cheap to use. Anyone can use the word innovation regardless of any application to reality or to any sense of progress or any real thing. So the first thing I recommend that people do, if you want to make your group, the team you worked on, more innovative, be more innovative on a project that you're working on, innovation meaning a significantly better new idea that you're able to put into practice. All things start with some idea, some abstract idea. And at the end of the day, when you become famous like Edison or Einstein or Bill Gates or I don't know who else you want to name, at some point in time it becomes an innovation. The first thing you want to do is to break this down. There's a lot of work. I mean, in the case of like Newton, there's a lot of work that goes on in between something being an idea and it becoming an innovation, meaning it was accepted by the world as a progressive new thing. So a simple thing to do is to break that down. Break it down. Here's one way to break it down. Any idea that you ever have, the first thing that's going to happen in the working world, you're going to have to pitch that idea to somebody. You're going to have to pitch it to somebody, convince them why it's worth their time. Maybe that's your manager, maybe it's a coworker, maybe it's your spouse. So you're going to have to convince someone of your idea. And it probably won't be that long in the process of whatever grand scheme that you have that you're going to have to do that to someone. So you have an idea, you've got to pitch it to someone. Once you pitch it to someone and say, okay, yeah, spend the afternoon working on that, you've got to make a proof of concept. A sketch, a drawing, a whiteboard diagram saying, hey, here's roughly how it will work. Then you have to use that to convince someone to actually make a prototype, a rough version of the thing actually working, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can break down any innovation from the first multitasking operating system to the first light bulb, to the first suspension bridge, and break it down. Suspension bridges, I don't know who invented this suspension bridge, but I'm thinking of Roebling for some reason. Roebling had the idea for the Brooklyn Bridge. He had to pitch it to New York City. Had to build a model, proof of concept, made a et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now all these skills, now this becomes like real understandable work. You have a great idea, so what? Convince someone of it. That's your first skill set you need to have if you're an innovator. First skill set you're going to need to have. Question? Yes?
Is
seems like a lot of the people that you've been talking about are kind of the model of the single innovator, kind of off in the woods doing their own thing.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, did Newton have to go pitch his idea to go explore gravity before he just went off and did it?
Great question. So I got to remember to repeat the question. His question was, a lot of the people I picked are lone, psychotic, Ted Kaczynski type innovators. And he's saying, well, what happens, what's the difference between that and someone who works on a team or in a corporation, et cetera? In most cases, the Newton case is interesting because he was actually, most of the people who are pinned as recluses, they kind of weren't. Newton was. Lived alone in the woods, partly because there was the plague, so that kind of made people, I'm going to have my house in the woods, I'm going to stay there. But he had the whole scientific community to convince of all of his work. So the Royal Science of Britain, the Royal Science of England, I forget, there was a community, you had a paper, you showed them the paper, you basically pitched them the paper, and they would vote on it and debate on it to say whether it's valid or not. So he had a community he had to vet his ideas through, but it wasn't at the pitching stage, it was, it'd be later on. But anyway, you're making a great point. In order for an idea to be accepted, no matter how brilliant you are or whether you're working as a recluse, eventually you need a customer. You need to convince your customer why they should even look at what you've made. Pitching. Anyway, the exercise here is as follows. If you're in your organization, you're saying, if someone says to you, we need to be more innovative, we need to be more creative, more aggressive, more progressive, the first question to ask is, wait, where in this scheme or a scheme like this do the ideas die? Where are they dying? In lots of organizations, they die before pitches get made. Lots of people walking around the organization with ideas who are afraid to suggest their idea to somebody else. If that's your problem, then don't worry about creative thinking classes. Don't worry about innovation, blah, blah, blah. You need to get people comfortable talking about their ideas, which is a completely orthogonal skill set to actually being an intellectual. Being a communicator is this other skill set. So very quickly in this chart, we recognize your other skills that don't require genius level intellect, don't require taking acid trips to find wacko new ideas. These are ordinary skills that just need to be applied in sequence. So the second pragmatic thing for you is ask yourself, where in this process are ideas dying? Now, when I worked at Microsoft, I saw lots of groups that would make it, lots of ideas, project teams that would make it to here. We'd have prototypes and plans, acceptance of risk. Then when it came time to say, you know what, we need to shift 20 developers off of version 5, our existing product, to go work on this new thing, we'd fail. Unwillingness to actually fully accept the risk of taking on a new direction. That's where we'd fail. Other groups at Microsoft or other companies, hey, happens earlier on. People are not even free. They don't have enough time or enough resources available to make prototypes. So break it down. Don't allow innovation to be this fuzzy thing. When someone says we need to be more innovative, say, wait, do we need more ideas? Do we need more people pitching ideas? Do we need more proof of concept work? Do we need more prototype? And now all of a sudden you have something you can talk about and fight for. I need my team to get 10% more time every month if you actually want us to make more proof of concept designs. Now you're having a meaningful, tangible conversation. And the other thing to say about innovation is that it's such a buzzword, it gets thrown around so often. In lots of cases, groups are not ready, teams or companies are not ready to be innovators. Innovation is risk-taking. You have to be really good at what you're doing if you're going to try to be progressive and do something so much better. And if a team is incompetent, can't even manage to ship crappy software on time, why are you even throwing down the I word? If a team is poorly managed where morale is continually low, the quality of work out the door is low, why would anyone ever throw down the I word? In the case of all these people we talked about, they spent lots of time perfecting their craft, becoming great at the basics of what they did before they ever became people who would make things that were breakthrough level things. Bob Dylan, Van Gogh, you know what they did for the first half of their career? They studied the masters, the experts at what those fields, experts in those fields, and they mimicked them and they copied them. How did, in the case of Bob Dylan, it was Woody Guthrie. You wanted to, how does Woody Guthrie sound so good? What are the chord patterns he uses? He would study and become an expert in his field. I can make a very good replica of a Woody Guthrie song. And once he had mastery, then he started thinking, now I need to make a revolution. Now I need something that's better, progressive, change things, because he had enough mastery. So the common fallacy I see today, it's so frequent, innovation, we want to be innovators. How good is what you're making now? Oh, it's awful. How are you possibly going to even conceive of making something radically better if you can't make something that's half decent? Interesting question to think about. Now, yes?
Innovation, improving something. So you start with something, it's never going to be good when you start. And you know it sucks. You can still call it innovation when you're improving on something.
The word innovation is a messy, sloppy word, and there are many definitions of it. I honestly don't like any of them. So as soon as you can try to make a point or have a conversation without use of the word, you're better off. So I use the word good instead. That yes, you do want to start with something, and yes, it probably, when you start off, it's good to have low bars. You want to say, hey, we're just going to try this out, great. But if at the end result you're not able to make something that's good, you don't feel like you've released your software to the web, and you don't think it's that good, then the goal for the next release should be to make it good. Not to make it innovative, not to change the world, not to change the industry. Make something good. If you're failing to make something good, it's sort of like if you're failing to win a silver medal, why would you be talking about winning the gold? Set a goal, you have some ability to prove your mastery, develop your mastery before you set a goal that's that high. So you're right, that at the beginning, you need a prototype, you need to make mistakes. We'll talk more about mistake making in a second. But that's about at the beginning. When you're shipping stuff and you're sending it out the door, if you're unlikely to make something that's going to be a breakthrough if you can't make something that's even on the table. So we'll come back to that though. Speaking of mistake making, one of the other fallacies we have regarding innovation has to do with science. We talk about, we're not doing science. Science is rigorous. Science is you do A, you do B, you get C. Very rigorous. That's the science we're taught in school. You put this chemical in, you add this much, and poof, now you get the thing that does the thing, right? That's what the science we're taught is understood and manifest, clear and logical. That's true. For science, it's already been discovered. If you look at science, the scientific work of things before they were discovered, breakthrough science, where they're trying to pave new ground, it's entirely the opposite. And the best story I can refer to in that regard, regarding mistake making, is this story. The story of the discovery of DNA. Discovery of DNA, which happened in the late 40s, early 50s. Before this, believe it or not, we had no real proof about the human connection to evolution. We had no real proof for any of these things. So these guys said, we believe there's a structure, a genetic structure, we don't know what it looks like, genetic structure that establishes evolution, establishes hereditary, and we're going to prove it. They had no support, very little support from their universities, very little support from science. They were, again, renegades and recluses. And this book is their story of how they made these breakthroughs happen. And their story is a very human story. It's a 120-page book. It's not that technical. I'm not that bright, and I understood it. So you should be able to make it through. And it's largely a sequence like this. We kind of have this idea. Not sure if it'll work. We try it out. Experiment, fail. Oh, but we learned some new thing, a new question. Let's try to experiment with that. Oh, failed in an entirely unexpected way. Not sure what to do. But wait, now there's another thing that we see that we could not have seen before until this failure. We have a new hunch. We're going to make a whole new bunch of experiments that follow that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's an intuitive process. Failure-laden, uncertain. And the key word is experimentation. Experimentation, science experiment, in the proper sense of the word, that you don't know what the outcome's going to be. That's the only way that you can possibly find new ground, to do something where you're not certain of what the outcome is going to be. Just a fantastic example of that story. Something we now take for granted, we take as accepted, that we do have a DNA structure that binds us and explains our reproductive cycle, et cetera, et cetera. When the time was done, it was a series of ad hoc experiments that led to that discovery. So another pragmatic question to ask, simple question to ask. If ever you feel like you're being asked to be more innovative, you're being asked to be more creative, the first thing to say is, where can I experiment? Where am I allowed to experiment? Okay, boss, you tell me you want my innovation threshold numbers, whatever metric you have, to go up by 70%. Okay, how many experiments am I allowed to do every week? Well, none, because we want you to be efficient. Done. Can't win. We'd have no DNA if Crick and Watson, and I forget her name, Rosalind Quick? Crick. No, the third. Franklin, thank you. If the three of them, get over remembering the name, the three of them were told to be efficient, they never would have made the discoveries they did. Experimentation and creativity are messy processes. So again, there's a connection. Ask to be creative, ask to be innovative. Where are you allowed to experiment? If the answer is nowhere, then innovation and creativity is impossible. Impossible. Some recent examples of experimentation paying off in stories that we don't usually hear that often. So YouTube, who here's used YouTube? YouTube, many of you, great, okay. So YouTube, video site, popular, was bought by Google, etc. The YouTube guys, anyone know how they started their company, what their goal was? Sorry? A game. No, you're on Flickr, which we'll talk about in a second. Hot or Not. Who here knows what Hot or Not is? Come on. So Hot or Not is the website where people put up pictures of people they know, and then everyone else comes by and votes on whether they are hot or not. That's the whole website. Makes millions of dollars every year. Don't you feel like an idiot now? Could have been you, right? Hot, hot or not. Anyway, the YouTube guys, they saw this and said, you know what? We can do a video version of hot or not. We think we had the server and bandwidth issues. They were technical guys. They thought we could do a video version of hot or not. So they started out building this thing that could be this video dating, and pretty quickly in that process, like, you know what, this hot or not thing, maybe we can make this more general. There's a more general use for video, cheap, easy video online. That's what set them on the path to YouTube. Hot or not. So they did something. It was an experiment. Didn't work out the way they thought. But in doing the failed experiment, they found a new direction to go in that led them to something that became a billion-dollar company. Flickr, which is the game story. Flickr, these guys started as a MMORG, multi-online role game player, virtual, one of those things. And they were running out of money. The game was called Never-Ending Game? Game Never Ending? Anybody know? Game Never Ending. Let's assume it was Game Never Ending. Anyway, 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, they don't have enough money to continue making the game. One of the features they've been working on was a way to have chat in the game for two players of the game. And in this chat, they wanted to be able to share photos with each other. Because while you're playing, hey, look at my picture of my dog. Oh, that's cool. Look at the picture of my cat. Okay. And as they did this little thing, they realized, hey, maybe there's, this is kind of interesting tool. The way we've designed it is actually pretty neat. Because they had a couple UI designer type people. Pretty neat. Maybe there's a more general purpose way for us to use this thing we've made. So they had a big, big discussion. They decided, you know what? We're going to take our remaining money and put it on that. What if we made a tool that was purely about sharing photos? Boom. That's how Flickr, not Flickr. Flickr's a whole other thing. Flickr might be part of the hot or not thing. So Flickr, that's how Flickr was born. So again, experiment. You could argue that every startup company is a kind of experiment. There's many uncertainties in the outcome that you cannot predict up front. They started out going in one direction. Through the failure of that experiment, the game company was failing. The hot or not thing was failing. They said, you know what? We now have an opportunity, given what we've built that failed in one direction, to repurpose it and go in another direction. So you need experimentation. And you can look at all the other, the famous stories that we have in our industry. Apple, these guys, the experiment they wanted to do. Steve Wozniak, who worked at HP at the time, he wanted to make a personal computer at Hewlett-Packard. He went to his boss and said, hey, we should make a personal computer. Computers in your home. Personal use. It's like, no, that's not, HP, come on, we're not going to do that. We don't ever want to make personal computers. So he quit. Jobs and him got together through whatever the club was. That was how they started Apple. So it was an experiment, something he tried to do. He tried to pitch this idea to Hewlett-Packard and was told no. The Google founders, a similar story. They had this technology. They did not want to start their own search engine company. They went around to Alta Vista and Yahoo and a few of the other players in the search engine game at that time and said, hey, we've got this technology to sell you. And they were told no. Search engines can't make any money. Search engines can't make any money. Commodity. That's what they were told by every search engine vendor. So their original plan, which was to take their technology and license it and sell it, was a failure and forced them to start their own company, etc. And I'm sure you guys know the rest of that story. So you got to look for failures. There are always, any innovation you find, no matter how successful it was or amazing or perfect it seemed, there's a failure and a set of experiments that made that opportunity possible. So lessons so far. Whenever you hear a magic story, an epiphany story that talks about a magic moment, what happened 5 minutes before, 10 minutes before, a week before? What are the patterns that were involved? How many times did Newton sit under a tree? How many startups did this guy start up? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What were the experiments that failed that created this new kind of knowledge that led to success? These are the interesting questions to ask because they're behind every innovation success story that we have. Which leads us to this man. Now, I'm talking about the fictional guy. The William Shatner we I'll talk about later, but I'm going to talk about Kirk for now. So Kirk represents an interesting thing about history. So one of the things that came out of this book, all the research I did for this book, all these stories I read, was trying to get an understanding of the breadth of the history of innovation, the patterns that get repeated again and again when people try to do something new. And they run all the way through, from Newton to the Apple guys, to Bill Gates, to the Google, runs all the way through. And some of our understanding or our self-deception about innovation comes from this guy, because there's a ton of relationships between exploration and innovation. And exploration is all about discovering new places to go. We have a map. We've been here, never been there. I'm going to go there. That's what explorers say. And Columbus and Magellan, da Gama, all those people were the first venture capitalists. They got money to go to places no one had been. Venture capital. That's where the term, I believe that's where the term comes from. Venture capital. The problem, though, is that the only story we really know about explorers is this story, this fictional Star Trek, late 60s, weird 70s story about what goes on when you explore. And it's a TV show. Not real. This is not how exploration works. See, in the real exploration, what I just described is a really ridiculous thing to say. It's probably something none of us would ever say in our lifetimes. That there's a map. That's the map of the whole known world. And there's a spot on it that's it's empty. And we're going to say to someone, very powerful, king, queen, whoever, I want to go there. And I want you to pay me to go. And I'm going to bring back more wealth than you've ever seen. I promise you. That's a crazy thing to say. Because most of them died. The explorers died miserably. This is 1600s, 1500s, scurvy, and you know the maps with the dragons. Like they believed all that stuff. These boats were not built very well. They didn't have food and preservatives. There was no microwave oven on these boats. Right? This is not Princess Line cruise ships. Most of these people died and were miserable. And most of their time was spent, is there anything there? Okay, day 2. Is there anything there? Day 3. Anything there? Day 4. We're going to kill the captain because we're going to die. Day 5? Anything? No. These are really depressing, horrible trips. Now, this guy, our mythological view of exploration. Episode opens up, come out of warp drive, land on the planet, chaos, drama, civilization, war, commercial. Action all the time. Woo! We got innovation happening all the time. Something's going on all the time. Guy in the red shirt's dying within 5 minutes. All this action happening, which is completely ridiculous. This is meant to serve a narrative that's a television narrative. Get enough action going on so you'll stay through the commercial. That's the goal of this story. And that's the basis for our thinking of exploration. The real exploration, again, experimentation, high risk of failure, willingness to confront situations most people would ignore, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the true story, just to tie this home to history, anyone know who this guy is? Tesla's uncle, maybe? No. Magellan. This is Magellan. What is Magellan known for? Circumnavigating the globe. Didn't do it. I would never show you something that actually happened. That would break the whole model. The boat did, but he did not. He died halfway through his trip, probably as a result of a mutiny over a fight over which way off the spot of the map that was empty, which way off the spot of the map that was empty they should go. Magellan did not make it. Captain Cook is actually the basis for a lot of the Star Trek model. And the reason why the red shirts die all the time is the British red shirts. The British red shirts were the Marines. They were the first guys to go on land, and they were the first people to die. That's how the story. That may be a myth, so don't quote me on that one. All right. So lesson so far. You always want to dig into the first-person histories. The closer you can get to the people who are actually there, the less prone the stories are going to be to mythology. Less. Sometimes people have their own self-interest involved, and their stories are more mythological. But generally, it's less true. The stories that get told that are mythological and epiphany-based are often media stories, hype magazine articles, where the goal is to hype up some abstract idea of what greatness and wonder is. So one trick in this, one secret tactic in this, to reveal what actually happened is to pick something that you think is ordinary. Pick something you already take for granted. And study the day before that thing was invented. The chair, the telephone, the automatic transmission. Study the day before it was invented, and all of a sudden you'll be like, oh my God, I had no idea. Because you'll find a connection to these stories. Because I know in my own stories, working in corporations, working with publishers, there's all these forces that resist change. They resist progress, and you're trying to be a progressive person. You feel like you are the only person in the world that's ever had to deal with that kind of conflict. But the truth is, every innovation dealt with that kind of conflict. Every innovation dealt with that kind of a challenge that needed to be overcome. So study the origins of an ordinary thing. All right, my last thing for you, I have about 10 minutes to go through this, is about people, and in particular management regarding innovation. People and management regarding innovation. So this is my last history story, my last black and white photo, I promise. Anyone know what this is a picture of? Loom. Sorry? A loom. You're close. Story about looms. Looms. Any loom majors here? Textile majors? No? No, I don't know what that is. You're destroying the loom. Luddites! Okay. Anyone know who the Luddites were? I bet if I asked who the Klingons were, you'd all say, I know. But Luddites, no. Yes?
Luddites wanted to go back to the hand ways of making fabric when the machinery was introduced. They were just resisting the cottage industry becoming industrialized.
Got it. You're on the money. I'm going to give you a slightly embellished version of that story. The Luddites, this is Industrial Revolution England. And a large part of the population in this area of England, they made their living working looms, manual labor. They pushed these things back and forth, and that's how these textiles were made, pushing this thing back and forth. It's industrial age. Steam power was becoming its force, this new way to make engineering work, this new way to make industry work. And this textile mill decided to switch from manual labor to steam-based labor. So these guys show up at work one day. They show up at work. Like, hey, I'm ready to get started, boss. And the boss is like, hey, we don't need you. Sorry. Go home. Find something else to do. See you later. And they were not very happy about this. So one of the guys, as this mythology embedded in the story, it's kind of hard to sort of exactly what happened. But as the story goes, a guy named Ned Ludd, which may be a fictitious name, picked up a sledgehammer and beat the crap out of the loom. The theory being if he destroyed the loom, they'd need him again. Kind of a basic principle there. No loom, they need me. Great. He got a bunch of his other loomists, or whatever they were called, professional loomers, I don't know. And they got together. They were basically a gang, and they destroyed looms. They were eventually caught by the British government. They were hung, and that was the end of the story. But the word Luddite lives on. In fact, it's a word that many of you have heard because we use it as a slur. Someone who does not upgrade to Vista. Luddite. You're resisting the future, right? That's what the word means. In common usage, that's what the word means. Which is fine, because in a sense that's true. But the other truth of the story, though, is more important. It's more important to you if you're coming to a talk about innovation, is that the real part of the story has nothing to do with technology, it's to do with human nature. So all of you are here right now, you're listening to me talk, or you're falling asleep as I try to keep you awake. You're going to go back to your office. And imagine if when you go back to your office, you go into your room, or your cubicle, and on your chair there's a little box. There's a little machine with a little light that's going off, boop, boop, boop. Kind of like something out of Star Trek, boop. And you're looking at it, and your boss comes and says, hey, we don't need you anymore. Sorry, didn't you get the message? We now have an automated version of what you do that works twice as fast for half as much money. No health insurance and no performance reviews required, and nothing. So goodbye. I'm sure all of you would have some kind of violent emotional reaction to that box. This box is now destroying your life. It means your kids are going to starve. You have no health insurance anymore. This little mechanical box. Now that response has nothing to do with technology, nothing to do with innovation, nothing to do with creative thinking. It has to do with human nature, resisting change. Once you have something that makes you comfortable, you do not want it to change. By and large, you do not want it to change. So when you create something, when you innovate something, you make something new, some new release, some new way to do something, some new algorithm, there's some group of people in the world that don't want your change. They don't. In fact, they will just like the example I gave you, they will defend the old position to the death because they feel that everything they've built depends on their ability to defend it. And if you want to understand the story of innovation, that's a much more interesting angle. Why certain things were accepted in certain cultures and certain things were not. This theory is not mine. This theory is a version of a theory called diffusion of innovation. Diffusion of innovation. And this is done by this is from a book by Rogers, who's an anthropologist. Anthropologists being people who see the world from a human-centric view. The culture explains most of what goes on and why. And in this book he documents, why did the use of boiled water, which helps preserve, helps kill bacteria in food, it's a medical, the Western world sees it as a medical benefit, it's a safer way to eat and live. Why did certain cultures adopt that and others did not? Same technology, different cultures, why? That point of view explains why some people are much more successful getting innovations adopted than others, because they understand the cultures they are in better. They don't walk into a room and say, my idea is 5 times better than the old idea, when the person they're talking to, is the VP of their group, is the inventor of the old idea. This goes on all the time, because most people who are creative, who are intellectuals, who are inventors, focus on the idea. They're like, I finally got the gem. I have the thing. And if I'm going to convince someone to make a change, I got to focus on this magical thing I've made. Again, the epiphany, the magical thing. When in the human view, the magical thing is irrelevant. It's about the person in power. What do you have to say to them to make them understand the value of what you have? And talking about the idea first is probably not the way to do it. So you can look at why some great ideas in the world have failed, why the metric system, for example, never took off in the United States. Honestly, it's a much better system in many ways, has some limitations, much better, has a lot less to do with the fact that the metric system is better or worse than the British system, has much more to do with the politics in America in the late 1780s, and who was in power at the time and why, and what the issues that were on the table and why, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a better question to ask if you want to be more creative is, wait a second, what's the culture I'm trying to be creative in? What kinds of persuasions and pitches are useful in my culture that get ideas accepted or not? And this is another orthogonal thing. This has almost nothing to do with your ability to be creative. Almost nothing to do with your ability to come up with a radical new idea. It has to do with your sense of people, your sense of sociology, and arguably your sense of politics. Okay. How much time do I have left? If I just get a time check before I keep rambling. Anyone have?
20.
So I have. How much time do I have? Okay, so I'm going to go for another 10 minutes and I'll open for Q&A. Is that good? Okay, all right. So I'm going to skip this thing about Taylor. I really wanted to talk about Taylor. Someone, if you want to know about Taylor, which explains the horror and evil of management in the world, I will answer it in Q&A, but I can't answer it now. It's up to you guys. It's up to you guys. So the last story I wanted to tell you is I do a lot of history. I want to try to give you some pragmatic pieces, some things that you can hold on to and research and maybe can be of use to you when you leave. History is to give you some perspective, but I want to give you stuff you can use when you leave. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is this basic model. The simplest model of all the companies I studied, all the case studies I read, all the places I've been, all the companies I've been to, etc. This is the simplest model when thinking about managing innovation, the simplest model. It's got 3 pieces to it. Delegation, risk-taking, which includes the experiment stuff we talked about, and rewarding initiative. That's the whole thing, the 3 pieces. And the story I'm going to use to illustrate this is about this company. So 3M, who knows what 3M stands for?
Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing.
Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing. Who's from Minnesota? Anybody? Minnesota's? No? Okay. 3M. So everyone knows that. Can anyone name a product that 3M has made? Post-it note and Scotch tape. You guys are good. You got 2. All right. Now, what does Post-it notes have to do with Minnesota or mining? Nothing. 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 So I'm going to tell you that connection because it ties a lot of stuff we talked about already together. 3M started as a mining company in the early 1900s. Mining still being a huge industry. It was a growth venture capital industry because we're still on the rise of the industrial age. Bridges and skyscrapers are going up now, so people need minerals. They need iron. They need all these other things that you use with iron. I don't know what they are. But you need all this stuff that comes from the ground. That I know. So these guys said, hey, we're a bunch of young guys. Let's get some money together. We're going to get this stuff out of the ground. We're going to sell it. 3M started as a mining company. They built their first mine. Being young, relatively ignorant men about mining, they made a big mistake. Turned out the stuff they were mining out of the ground, based on all this borrowed money from the banks, was not iron. It was not iron, but not the abrasive material that they were trying to dig up. It was the equivalent of fool's gold. It looked kind of like the stuff they wanted, but wasn't, and was almost worthless. So what did they do? Most of us would quit and go back to work at some other company. They said, no, we've learned something now. We are not going to try to mine that thing. We are going to pick a more narrow kind of mining focused on sandpaper. Focused on making kinds of sandpaper used to abrase other things. Great. Focus on sandpaper. They built their second mine. It took them about 5 or 10 years. They started to finally get some profit, started to finally pay back their lenders. Slow rise, was not a meteoric overnight success story. Sandpaper business. Sandpaper, again, being a big industry at the time. You did not have Home Depot or Lowe's with the sandpaper aisle. Right? They're one of the few companies manufacturing sandpaper. Now, one of the engineers, sandpaper engineers, a guy named Richard Drew, was going to one of his clients, an automobile manufacturing company, and showing them models, prototypes of stuff he was making for sandpaper. Showing them different versions, right? Which we do all the time with site visits and customers, same thing. And he noticed, he said, hey, he noticed that one of the things they were trying to do with this car company was make 2-tone paint for the car, blue and green. And they're having trouble finding a way to reliably, in a manufacturing setting, keep the 2 colors separate. So he's sitting there looking at that going, I think I might be able to fix that. I don't know. I have an idea. A thought that many of you probably had at work or in a meeting where you see some problem that's not, you don't own it, but you see the problem out there. You're like, hey, I might be able to, okay, I'm curious. I'm going to go spend some time on it. So he did. Went back to his lab, put some stuff together, and had an idea he thought was interesting, showed it to his boss. His boss said, Richard, smart guy, sandpaper engineer here for many years. I'm paraphrasing here, by the way. This is not a little transcript of what was said, but for entertainment purposes, I'm going to take that liberty. He said, look, it's interesting, but Minnesota, mining, manufacturing, tape, this whole thing with the paint and the car, not our job. So don't do that. Make more sandpaper. So Richard Drew said, all right, hey, the boss said not to work on this, so I won't. Goes back to work on sandpaper, but that idea is in his head. He's so curious about it. He's like, I could solve it. So he spends more time doing it. His boss finds out about it again. They have the same conversation with there's more tension now. Come on, Richard, focus on what you're doing. Happens one or two more times. Eventually, Richard Drew decides he's so close now, he just needs to make a couple of more prototypes. He knows his boss is not going to support him on this, but he needs money to make the final prototype. So what does he do? As an engineer, it turns out he can write receipts or justify receipts for $50. He needs $1,000 or something to do it. So what does he do? He makes up the receipts and buys the stuff that he needs and finishes the project. And the project was masking tape. The birth of masking tape. He goes back to the client and says, hey, I got your solution here. You put this down. Once it's done, you pull it back off. Boom, presto, manufacturing solution to two-tone car painting. They're like, hey, this is pretty cool. He showed it to William McKnight. They were like, well, hey, I'm not a big fan of this idea, but if this one client likes it, maybe there's more manufacturing clients that like it. Great, we'll make more, and off we go. Within a few years, it had the growth trajectory that was greater than all their other products. Masking tape had all these other uses they never anticipated. And the key part of the story is this. It's not about sandpaper or becoming miners or anything like that. Or fraud. What's the fraud part? Oh, the fraud, yes. Well, fraud, you want to make an omelet, you got to break some eggs. So the key part is this. The boss, this is the key part of the story. His boss, William McKnight, he's got an interesting thing going on in his head now because there's this project that's quickly becoming the fastest growing product that 3M has. And it's a product he wanted to kill 5 times or 4 times or 3 times. So he's like scratching his head like, I kind of fucked up here. Had I killed this, we might still be making these moderate profits with mining. And now that we've done this masking tape, a few years later they had cellophane tape, which was a see-through tape, and all of a sudden you had this brand explosion, this whole new line of stuff that would show up in the market. So William McKnight asked a pivotal question here that's pivotal for all managers or leaders or project managers or whatever. He said, my management philosophy was an inhibitor of innovation. And I want our company to continue to grow. I see my job as a manager, eventually became a chairman and a C-level executive. I want our company to grow. So my philosophy has to be something very different than what it was. And he set about a program of managing for supporting people like Richard Drew. Then instead of shutting them down or making them work around the system, he wanted them to build this stuff in. Why can't 3M support this kind of activity while at the same time supporting the existing product lines? So that's how you get from mining to Post-it notes. Because it was William McKnight, the guy who played this pivotal negative role in masking tape, that created a culture where innovation and invention was status quo. It was expected if he was an engineer to do things outside of the boundaries. How did he do this? Well, Google these days makes a big deal about the 20% rule, 20% time, whatever they call it. That was a function, a specific management rhetorical function that was created by 3M. They called it 5% time or 10% time, or with inflation now it's 20%, right? But back then it was something smaller, but the idea was exactly the same. And the idea is best embodied by this little speech. Now, I have heard so many executive speeches in my life. I've been to many company meetings, Microsoft company meetings and otherwise, and I hated them all. Because they're written and described in this way that is so flowery and abstracted from reality that they're difficult to connect with. William McKnight wrote this 3-paragraph thing, and of all the literature I have read by active CEOs or chairmen in every company in the world, this is the best piece of writing about managing innovation. I'm going to read it. Don't worry. I'll read it. You don't have to strain your neck. The best piece of writing I've seen on this, period. So I'm going to read it to you. It's not that long, and I'm going to talk about it for a minute, and then we'll open for Q&A. As our business grows, it becomes increasingly necessary to delegate responsibility and to encourage men and women to exercise their initiative. This requires considerable tolerance. Those men and women to whom we delegate authority, if they are good people, are going to want to do their jobs in their own way. Mistakes will be made, but if a person is essentially right, the mistakes he or she makes are not as serious in the long run as the mistakes management will make if it undertakes to tell those in authority exactly how they must do their jobs. Management that is destructively critical when mistakes are made kills initiative, and it's essential that we have many people with initiative if we are to continue to grow. The 3 pieces I'd call out here: delegate authority and responsibility. Instead of William McKnight saying, I don't think you should work on this, he should say, I don't think you should work on this, but if you're really convinced, you should take part of your time and work on it anyway. No matter what I or any executive says, you're smart, we hired you for your intellect and creative ability, do it anyway. So the fraud thing, William McKnight would probably come back later and say, that was probably the right thing to do. There should be a budget for you to do that. Maybe not a big budget, but enough that if you have a really good idea, you can hack and find your way to do it. Second, mistakes will be made. Mistakes will be made. There's not a single executive budget in the world that says, $10 million for equipment, $20 million for buildings, $6 million for mistakes. You don't see that. Mistakes, this is like you've screwed up. You should not be CEO if you're talking about mistakes. He says right here, mistakes will be made. We know this. And this is good, provided they're interesting mistakes, like the ones we talked about earlier. Provided they're the kinds of mistakes that give you a new kind of knowledge where you can ask a new question you would not have found before. Mistakes will be made. And a manager's job or a leader's job is to support those mistakes. I'm not saying you should ship those mistakes. I'm not saying to release bad stuff. But part of your development process should be about experimentation and exploring and prototyping in a structure that rewards you for doing that without a negative ramification on customer quality and customer experience, which can be done. And the last part is about rewarding initiative, rewarding people who do it anyway, finding a way, this is the most difficult thing to do, because managers are taught the authoritarian-centric model that I am the captain of the ship. I'm Alexander the Great. If I say go west, everyone should go west. This is saying, when I say everyone should go west, I mean most of you, but those of you who have a really good idea and can justify it to themselves it's worth your time should go northwest or southeast and do their own thing, which is a very difficult thing for a manager to maintain, because for an insecure manager, this is disrespecting their authority. Disrespecting of their authority. So balancing that tension, you're running against the opposite of what your average MBA school teaches you what you're supposed to be doing as a middle manager. So it's very difficult to maintain. However, this is the core thing. He's got them in 3 paragraphs: delegation, finding a way to fund mistakes and support mistakes, rewarding initiative. And the kicker to all this for me is he wrote this in 1948. He wrote this 60 years ago. And the number of companies who have managers that on average live up to this today is very, very small. And instead of all the attention we put on technology, what technology are you using? Or some new innovation method or project management, agile methods, or whatever thing we do, is if that's going to do it for you? No. It's about delivering on these core values. And if people want to have a playbook for being more innovative as a leader or a manager, or when you're talking to your boss as what you need from them in order to innovate or create for them, it's going to come from stuff derived from this kind of source. So I am out of time. These are the photo credits for the photos that I used. And if I don't get time for your question, I'd love questions. So please take a moment afterwards and send me an email and say, Scott, I thought your talk sucked because you didn't talk about blah. Can you talk about it in an email? And I'd be happy to do that. So thank you. Thank you for coming and listening. Thank you. Okay, questions? Yes, sir.
Say something about Chrome.
Chrome.
Yeah.
Well, you got to give me something to work with here. What do you want to know? I wrote a review of it, so you want to hear my take on Chrome, go to my website and search for Chrome. I wrote a 2-page review on it. I thought it was interesting. There were things about it that I liked. I thought that anytime that browser design gets interesting, I'm a happy guy. I worked on browsers for a long time. I left Internet Explorer right when the browser war ended, and there was a period of like 4 years where nothing happened, which depressed me to no end. And then Firefox came along, and I was happy just because now there's something to work with. And Microsoft, I know from my own experience, needs somebody to mix with. Somebody's got to be in there. It's a funny story, true story. When I worked in Internet Explorer, the best way to justify, it's kind of depressing, but it's true. The best way to justify a new feature in Internet Explorer was to claim you had proof that Netscape was going to do it. Claim you had a proof. And in fact, there were many ideas that we had, that we talked about and debated, we put on the shelf. And then as soon as Netscape shipped with it, we're like, there we go. Okay, that's approved. We know it's going to be approved. That's human nature and psychology. And Internet Explorer is actually probably the best set of experiences I had working for other managers. I had some fantastic managers on Internet Explorer. Guys like Joe Belfiore, Hadi Pratovi, who I don't think is around anymore, Chris Jones. There's a fantastic group of people that I learned a lot of. However good I became as a program manager came from working for people who I thought embodied a lot of what I'm talking about in a practical way. So I had a great experience there. Questions for me? Yeah.
You talked about innovation, say, of individuals. What about the environment that they're in? Whether the ideas that they heard about, say from reading like Galileo before him and all the what people were thinking before him,
So,
or the environment that they were living in or working in.
So the question is, what's the importance of environment?
Yeah, compared to the person.
Okay, environment is everything. If you take, it's not everything. It's underrated as an important part of the process. You take any prodigy level person, you take a Mozart, a Da Vinci, an Einstein, and Edison, and you put them 200 years in the past. They're born 200 years earlier than they were. You wouldn't know their name. You would not know their name. Mozart was born at a time when you know what was the hot artistic prospect in the world? Music, certainly for the wealthy classes in Europe. He was born at the right place in the right time. He also happened to be born by someone who's a musician. You know who Picasso's dad was? A painter. Now, had he been born to someone else, some other person, whatever prodigious thing we think is purely gifted to them, and not true. There's always a community, there's always a network. It's not to discount the role of the individual, but there's always someone who's older or more experienced or established in the community that at some point has to accept or acknowledge what's going on for it to work. And the same thing is true at work. Same thing is true at work. If let's say this gentleman were to go back, out of this discussion, he got a brilliant idea for his team. Fantastic breakthrough idea. Fantastic. He would have to go back, no matter how, let's say he might be an executive, I don't know. You could be, right? You might be. Someday. There's hope, right? You're a young man. He would have to go back and convince at least one person that his idea made sense. He would have to. It might even be the person who works for him. To convince him to do a good job on it, he may have to, there's always other people involved. And the successful places that we like to hold up on a pedestal, the Pixars and the Apples, some film directors, they build communities of people they work with regularly, that they have an understanding about how to help each other develop their ideas. How to help each other develop their ideas. There's a chapter in the book that's all about culture of ideas. And what a good manager recognizes is that his influence is only one thing. He wants to build a community of people who are all actively trying to help each other make their ideas better. Whether that's through criticism, through shared brainstorming, but the goal is for everyone to try to get the best ideas possible into the pool that makes it out the door. That they are orchestrators rather than dictators. So culture is huge. And establishing a culture is a large part of what managers and executives of successful creative organizations do. Yes? Yes, you. Sorry.
Side question.
Yeah.
Where did you learn to be such a great speaker?
Oh, thank you. I'm not prepared to answer that question. How did I learn? Practice and experimentation. And the secret, I've done this a lot. But the secret is I took a class on memory. Memory is also important. I took a class on improv class. Not like for theater people. It was for a community college class. I took it as a joke with Vanessa Longacre, who still works at Microsoft, and enoughGÇ. We're two friends who work together. What's the craziest thing we can do together? We're like, all right, we'll do that. And it turned out to be fantastic. Because it made me much more comfortable with being interrupted, which is good for difficult, smart crowds. You guys weren't difficult today, but Microsoft can be difficult crowds. And just being more open to what people are saying and following the flow of the room. So lots of practice. The other tip is watching yourself on video, which is painful. So you should get like a bottle of scotch or whatever your favorite thing is, and watch, oh my God. But then you do it again the second time, you get a little bit better, and you get better and you get more comfortable. And the last thing is, if I come up here acting like I'm going to have fun, then it's easier for you guys to maybe have a little bit of fun. If I get up here like, this is horrible, I hate, then it's never going to work. Because you guys won't have any fun either. So, yes, sir.
What are your comments on Steve Jobs, who was renowned as the biggest asshole of himself?
Yeah, okay, great question. All right, okay, so one thing I didn't say, so to repeat the question, what do I think of Steve Jobs, who many believe is the greatest asshole on the planet? Right, question? Okay.
A terrific product guy.
Yes, okay.
From a management standpoint.
Yes, you're totally right. So one thing I should say, I'm offering one point of view. I read a lot of history and have some experience. One point of view. There are lots of other points of views that may be equally valid for you in your context and make this stuff not work for you at all. So another point of view, which I don't talk about that much, I'm less of a fan of, is the authoritarian, auteur, dictatorial model, which if you study the arts, there's a lot of successes to be said for it. So Steve Jobs falls into that category. He's someone who is tyrannical, he has a reputation for being abusive and confrontational and dictatorial and centralized power. Not someone who has this open model where people can suggest ideas. No, very small group of people with a lot of power. My opinion of him is exactly what you said. I don't think he would be someone I would want to work for a long period of time.
He's the ultimate IC.
Yeah, ultimate IC. But he's been incredibly successful, and to a point of level of success that it's difficult to criticize his methods if you judge him based on the results. The whole story about him leaving and what happened to Apple and him coming back, there aren't that many stories like that in the history of corporate America. She does a lot of credit. But again, personally, I don't think I would want to be in that environment unless I had almost as much power as he did. Yeah. But my point is, though, that there is a lot of merit, if you look purely at results, for people who have destructive or abusive managerial styles. And the film world is notorious for this. The film world is notorious for this, with filmmakers who are abusive and cruel and vicious and treat people so poorly, and they justify it on their talent, which makes for some good art, but again, I would rather watch those films than work on those films.
So
Yeah.
a parallel question. Can you tell us about the managerial environment at Xerox PARC and how that might have affected coming up with the mouse and the Dynabook and the Windows concept?
So the question was at Xerox PARC, which for those who don't know, Xerox PARC is one of the great stories of uncapitalized innovation in the world. The development of the GUI interface, the laser printer, Ethernet, all came out of Xerox PARC, and Xerox got almost no revenue out of those three things. Three of the most pivotal, anyway. I know bits and pieces of the story, they're all secondhand. Some people who I know who actually worked for, there was one, I can't give you a good answer to this, but what I do know, there was one manager, one manager, if you ask me the name, I can dig it up. There's one manager who was in charge of the research group for 8 or 9 years. And he was the guy who was in charge during that whole time. And there are a lot of mixed things said about that guy, which I really feel bad I can't remember his name. But there are a lot of mixed things said about him. On the one hand, he did create an environment where it was egalitarian intellectually. The people had lots of ideas, there was lots of discourse, sometimes very confrontational, but the spirit was, we want the best ideas to come up. His own tactics for management and who he supported and didn't, there's some questions as to how fair a manager he was. But on the whole, if I had a list of criteria for what great managers of innovation are supposed to do, he'd probably score relatively well. Some people didn't like him, but in terms of the quality of people who were there and stayed there for years, another good sign. We have Alan Kay and who was the Ethernet guy? You had a whole bunch of high-powered people that stayed there for years. People who had choices for other places to go. If you can retain those really good people with options, you're doing something right in your management structure and your culture to maintain them. Yeah?
There's a kind of inherent paradox in what you're saying at the beginning of your talk about it being ridiculous to try and processize innovation. And yet later, and I think you're right, you talk about how all of the people who are successful innovators have behavioral patterns that we can learn from. When you start looking at an organization, an innovation team, for example, I'm sure that you think there are behavioral processes that you can cultivate in that team. How does that inherent paradox work out?
Okay, it's a great question. You're totally right. I confess. I have paradoxical suggestions. If I were to try to clarify the distinction, it's in the necessity for uncertainty. You can have a process provided you recognize how uncertain your outcomes are. If you're able to sit down every day and say, you know what, this is actually what I do as a writer. I know I have to sit down every day for an hour to write. I don't know how much writing I'm going to get done. I don't know how good it's going to be, but I'm going to sit for an hour and try to write. So I have a process, but there's this huge variable. I would never promise someone I am going to give them 300 words. I would never promise someone based on those outputs. That's sort of the distinction I'm saying. If you want to be creative, you have to recognize that there's inputs that you can commit to, but the outputs are always going to be uncertain. And if you look at these environments, these structures, research groups are structured the same way. They have goals and objectives, but they recognize how uncertain the outputs are going to be. So that's really what I meant to say at the beginning. You cannot guarantee outputs if what you are doing is creative, much less innovative or breakthrough or all the buzzword, radical, game-changing, all those stupid words that they use. You can't guarantee. There's no way you can control that. So that if I were to try to clean it up a little bit, clean up my take apart the paradox a little bit, that's how I would do it. You can have structure, but it's not going to be about the output. Yeah.
Your example of the Luddites raised some really interesting questions for me. It seems that any big innovation has impacts way beyond what you can easily anticipate on the people who create it, but also on the people who build it, the consumers, the society beyond that, and the physical world. So what do you think can be done when you're in the process of innovation to anticipate the effects? What's the responsibility? Is there a way to build that into the innovation?
Okay, so the question was, given the negative effects that all change is going to create, what can you do to mitigate that or balance it out? There are a bunch of books that have been written about this topic. I'm trying to think of a couple to mention. Crossing the Chasm by, what's his name? Jeff Moore. That's one that he's a marketing angle on that, but he's talking about exactly that. There's these gaps in getting people to move from one thing to another. I'd recommend it just because if you pick up that book, you'll find all the other books that take on the same line of thinking. Another thing that comes up a lot is finding easy transition points. That you're never going to revolutionize things all at once. So actually getting back to the Chrome thing, one funny thing about Chrome, this is a perfect example of like the inflation, epiphanary nature of the media. That when there's a release, now it's like, it's the new operating system. It's like the new, all of a sudden, 500 million installs are going to disappear, and all the people who haven't upgraded their machines in 10 years are going to do it now because, no, these transitions are slow. They're much slower than we like to admit, certainly than the media or the news or bloggers are prone to want to acknowledge because they want to talk, it's the most important thing ever happening now. So transitions are slow. And if you know that, then you want to pick a certain slice of the user base and say, you know what? These 10% are most vulnerable to adopting this new thing if we can solve this one problem. So I don't want to, fire 1 million people all at once. I want to find the 100 people who are thinking of quitting anyway. Loomers who don't like their jobs, right? How can I make something for them that they're going to willingly go? And then so you're looking for these not inflection point, but you follow what I'm saying, right? Okay.
Maybe one more question.
One more question.
Media talk about Microsoft as a company that doesn't innovate, but we just imitate and copy.
Yeah.
Having worked at Microsoft and now being out of Microsoft, what's your take on it? And do you truly think that they're set up for innovation?
Great question. The question was, Microsoft has a reputation for being an imitator and not an innovator, and what's my opinion? The more history you know, everyone's an imitator. Everyone. The only people who call people innovators or not, or innovators or imitators are people who are not really even in the game. They're not even, they're the commentators. So perfect example, Apple, right? They didn't invent digital music players. No, didn't invent the PC. Well, they were involved, but they didn't invent the PC. Certainly didn't invent GUI. Didn't invent the mouse, Doug Engelbart did. So were they imitators? Yeah. In a purely logical view, yes. They made great products. And honestly, that's really the important thing. How good is it what you made for the people you're trying to sell it to? Whether you were first or last or third or second, no one cares. The customers don't care, right? Because I had one of those crappy MP3 players. This Creative Labs, whatever, Z5, 20, they can't even give the name right? How are they going to get the product right? I had one of those things, horrible, right? You had to do this weird thing to skip a song, it was retarded. They were first. Did I care? No. So the right conversation to have is what you're making good. How do you make it really good that people love it? Whether you're first, last, third, or whatever. Microsoft Innovator, it depends on your perspective. If you've never used a GUI before, which a lot of the world, the DOS world, never had, Windows 95 was just, well, not Windows 95, but Windows 3.0, that was a big step forward for them. So from their perspective, it was an innovation. If you're Doug Engelbart or the people at Xerox PARC, it's trivia. So it all depends. Innovation in general is a very relative, speculative framework for thinking about things. And I very rarely recommend people talk about it. Make something really good. It's a much easier line to follow. Make it really good. Make it so people love it. If you have to borrow, okay. And Picasso, all the artists, they talk about stealing all the time. All the time. You cannot, if you're Picasso or you're Da Vinci, whoever, how do you think they learned how to paint? They looked at all the other paintings and they copied them. They copied them. Picasso's quote, which I'll probably butcher, is good artists borrow, great artists steal. I'm sorry? Stravinsky? Okay. Picasso borrowed it from him probably. See? There you go. Okay. So that'd be my answer. Are they or not? Maybe there's some validity to that Microsoft enters markets late. But most successful businesses do enter markets late. So, like Google's entering with a web browser right now. Are they imitators or not? Web browsers have been around for 14 years now. So why aren't they called imitators? Some of what they're doing is imitation. I'm sorry, out of time for official questions, but I will stick around for unofficial questions. Ooh. Thank you, guys.